In this 10-minute video, we're going to look at how the United States and the Soviet Union each crafted a different historical narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. To understand how each side spun the story differently, let's first briefly review what happened during those intense 2 weeks. During the early 1960s, relations between the United States and Cuba were, to put it mildly, tense. The U.S. had long been unhappy with the revolutionary government of Fidel Castro, which had overthrown the U.S.-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959. The new communist government in Havana quickly aligned itself with the Soviet Union, making Cuba a potential threat to American interests in the region. Additionally, the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, where the CIA attempted to overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles, failed spectacularly, deepening hostilities between the U.S. and Cuba even further. Then, in October 1962, American U-2 spy planes photographed missile sites under construction in Cuba. After analysis, it was determined that the missiles being installed were medium-range nuclear missiles capable of striking large portions of the U.S., including Washington, D.C. The U.S. government believed the presence of these weapons posed a major threat to national security and could shift the nuclear balance in favor of the Soviet Union. In response, President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine, a kind of blockade, to stop the delivery of more Soviet missiles and demanded the removal of the ones already there. This 13-day confrontation became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the end, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba. In a secret deal, the U.S. also agreed to remove its Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey, something the public would not learn about until years later. The world narrowly avoided nuclear war, but the event left a lasting legacy and became one of the defining moments of the Cold War. What's particularly fascinating is how differently the crisis has been remembered and taught in the U.S. and the USSR. Each country crafted a version of the story that fit its political needs and national identity. From the American perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis is often portrayed as a tale of national security, decisive leadership by President Kennedy, and a peaceful resolution achieved through American strength and diplomacy. Meanwhile, the Soviet version framed the crisis as a defensive response by the USSR to American aggression and emphasized Khrushchev's leadership in preventing nuclear catastrophe. Let's start with the American story. Here is an excerpt from an AP U.S. history textbook used in many high schools. As the Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, world leaders anxiously awaited their next move. Kennedy had made it clear that any attempt to land offensive weapons on the island would be considered a hostile act. The Soviets now had a choice to make: turn back and preserve their prestige by complying with the quarantine, or press ahead and risk all-out war. Choosing to comply, Khrushchev signaled to Kennedy that he wanted to negotiate. This diffused the crisis and ended the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. Over the next week, secret negotiations led to an agreement whereby the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba and the United States would remove its missiles from Turkey. This resolution to the crisis was hailed as an important victory for the young president, enhancing his reputation as a strong leader willing to stand up to communism. Here, the textbook emphasizes Kennedy's decisiveness and diplomacy. Khrushchev's choice to negotiate is acknowledged, but the narrative largely focuses on Kennedy's leadership and presents the outcome as an American success story. Now here's another excerpt from a different textbook. On October 27th, after more than 2 weeks of mounting tension, the crisis appeared to reach a turning point. As the deadline set by the United States for the removal of Soviet missiles approached, Premier Khrushchev sent a letter to President Kennedy proposing a compromise. Khrushchev suggested that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba if the United States would simultaneously remove its missiles from Turkey and not use the Cuban Missile Crisis as a pretext for attacking Cuba. Although the secret deal benefited both sides, only the Soviet withdrawal was made public. allowing Kennedy to claim sole credit for averting catastrophe. This allowed Kennedy to portray himself as a decisive and strong leader, which was important for the American public and policymakers during the Cold War. Again, we see a theme of American strength and strategic brilliance, with less attention paid to Soviet motivations or Cuban concerns. During the Cold War, Americans needed to believe their government was doing everything possible to stop the spread of communism. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a convenient example of American exceptionalism and triumph. In fact, you can see this clearly in Cold War-era propaganda, such as the "We Did It" poster created by the State Department. It shows a confident JFK standing in front of the White House, with missiles flying away from Cuba and the American flag waving proudly behind him. This poster was meant to boost confidence in the U.S. government and celebrate its handling of the crisis. Now let's turn to how the Soviet Union told the same story. Here's an excerpt from a Soviet-era textbook. Thus, the question was raised of placing our missiles on the territory of Cuba, which lies only 90 miles from the shores of Florida. Why did we decide to place these missiles in Cuba? There could have been various answers. However, we must answer this question based on the objective laws of Marxism-Leninism. We must take into consideration the concrete historical conditions and the concrete relations of forces. All of these elements may lead us to but one conclusion. The placing of the missiles in Cuba was dictated exclusively by the desire to bring about equilibrium in the balance of our nuclear forces. This explanation reflects the Soviet effort to justify their actions as defensive rather than provocative. The USSR already had long-range missiles, but by stationing them in Cuba, they could equalize the power dynamic with U.S. missiles in Turkey and Italy, and protect Cuba from a possible American invasion, especially after the Bay of Pigs. Although the Soviet Union viewed the placement of missiles in Cuba as a defensive measure, President Khrushchev ultimately decided to remove the weapons. The official Soviet explanation emphasized that this decision was made to preserve world peace and avoid a nuclear war. However, strategic considerations also played a role behind the scenes. The Soviet leadership realized that a military confrontation with the United States could potentially lead to catastrophic consequences. By voluntarily withdrawing the missiles in exchange for an American promise not to invade Cuba, Khrushchev was able to claim the moral high ground as a peacemaker, while also securing a secret agreement for the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. In the Soviet narrative, this decision was presented as a rational and responsible choice that saved millions of lives, in line with the Soviet Union's role as a defender of global peace. Soviet propaganda often portrayed the United States, and Kennedy in particular, as aggressive and dangerous. One famous Soviet poster shows a menacing Uncle Sam reaching toward a dove, symbolizing peace, with the Cuban and Soviet flags defending it. Another Soviet cartoon imagines how the U.S. would react if the roles were reversed. If Soviet missiles were stationed in Canada or Mexico, pointed at Washington. In this way, the Soviet story emphasized the USSR's role as a peacekeeper and protector of small nations like Cuba, while casting the United States as an imperialist bully threatening global peace. In the end, each country told the story it needed to tell. The United States highlighted national strength and Kennedy's leadership, downplaying concessions like the secret deal over Turkey. The Soviet Union presented its actions as protective and reasonable, and painted the U.S. as dangerously aggressive. These different versions of the Cuban Missile Crisis show us how history is often shaped not just by what happened, but by who is telling the story and why. The crisis wasn't just a political and military standoff. It was also a battle of narratives, memory, and identity. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help out, consider becoming a member.